want to welcome everyone once again, and thank you for joining us at the American Psychological Foundation at Home Fireside Chat. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Robert Sellers this evening as a recipient of the newly redesigned APF Gold Medal for Impact in Psychology Award. I am your host today, Dr. Melba Vasquez, Vice President of the American Psychological Foundation Board of Trustees. The APF, as most of you know, is a premier private grant-making foundation in psychology. APF provides over $1 million annually in grants awards, with increases coming every year thanks to the generosity of our donors. Our goal is to support psychologists and students who are using psychology to address major social issues in society and to improve lives. APF is unique in that it receives the overwhelming majority of its funding, about 95%, from individuals like those of you joining us this evening. We're so appreciative and grateful to you for your generous investment in APF and the important research we get to continue to fund. Now, as we go through the conversation today, if you have any questions for Dr. Sellers, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to address all questions at the end of the program. And now it's my incredible pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert M. Sellers. He most recently served as the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion, Chief Diversity Officer, and the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Education at the University of Michigan. As Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Sellers was responsible for the supervision and implementation of the university's 5-year strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and serves as a principal counsel to the president as a member of the university's executive leadership team. In regard to his scholarship, Dr. Sellers conceptualized a new framework of racial identity that impacted the way that racial identity is studied, opening the field for new examinations of the impact and effects of race in different situations and as an element of one's self-concept. Dr. Sellers further opened new doors in psychology by providing opportunity for the development of young psychologists, particularly those of psychologists, in part through the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Social Contexts that he established at the University of Michigan. I believe it's exciting that scholars from multiple disciplines can translate scholarly research into social action. This is an amazing model that can be very helpful to give back to the communities that we study. Welcome, Dr. Sellers.
Well, Melba, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to chat with you. I've been a fan for a very long time. The many contributions that you've made at APA, Division 45, now APF, and in just really impacting the mental health of people of color and women. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a sort of a mutual thing we have going here, respect. So you told me a little while ago that I can call you Rob.
Yes, so, absolutely, please.
So Rob, you, my first question to you, you are most well known for the development of the multidimensional model of racial identity, the MMRI. You were able to develop a reliable measure of Black racial identity, and this research has had expansive impact in understanding the importance of racial identity for a variety of outcomes. Can you speak a little bit more about the MMRI and the work that has come out of the initial research?
Sure. First, I want to make it very clear, I often get a lot of credit for it, but it is extremely collaborative effort in I had the great pleasure of, over the years, working with some outstanding students in developing the conceptual framework as well as the measure and the research afterwards. And really, the MMRI was attempts to provide a framework for understanding the heterogeneity with which African Americans define themselves in the context of race. It really addresses two very specific questions. The first is the significance question, and that is, how significant is race in the way in which any individual African American defines her or him or their self. And then the second is, what does it actually mean to be Black? And by posing those questions, the first thing that I hope steps out is that we assume that there is significant variation in the way in which African Americans answer those two questions. And that's important because one of the primary goals of our research and my research throughout my career is really to proclaim that Black people are human. Now, that may sound like a pretty simple, simplistic statement, but as I was growing up and going through the field, it would be difficult to make the case, if one read much of what was mainstream psychology, to come to that conclusion. There was always this assumption that either Black people either didn't show up in the literature, or they showed up as examples of what happens when bad things happen to people, or they showed up as somehow damaged or immature, or they showed up as stimuli for understanding how whites might experience stigma or prejudice or any other form that was focused on whites and not Blacks. And so oftentimes there was this notion of African Americans as this homogenous group. And one of the important aspects of being human is recognizing the heterogeneity of the human experience. And so that was extremely important. The second piece was, it was important to also think about the complexity in which African Americans deal with the notion of race in this particular society. So it's very much a contextual framework, recognizing that there's nothing universal about it or inherent about it, but that these are fundamental questions that people of African descent who are primarily socialized in this particular context grapple with. And that's race. And in some cases, grapple with it in ways of saying race is not a significant part of who I am. And so we wanted to be able to develop a conceptual framework, and then ultimately to be able to develop a measure that worked from it that would be able to capture that heterogeneity. And then looking at that heterogeneity, looking to see how those different attitudes and beliefs about the significance and meaning of race impacted African Americans' lives. And in doing so, always doing so with the notion that this is contextual, that in certain contexts, certain attitudes, certain beliefs may be associated with more positive outcomes, however that outcome is defined, and others may be associated with less positive outcomes. So we wanted to start off not with the notion that there was a particular set of identities that were inherently better or worse, more healthy or less healthy, but to really lay out a framework for understanding the breadth of possible identities and looking at the context in which they occur, and then linking them to very specific outcomes. That has pretty much been the focus of our work. And in doing so, we wanted to also be true to both our understanding of the great deal of work that sometimes is referred to as the underground approach, work that African-American psychologists in particular, and Black psychologists in particular, and now psychologists of color have done about their particular experiences that had, until fairly recently in our history, not been recognized by mainstream psychology. And wanted to make sure that we were true to that body and that literature, and to learn from that work, while at the same point in time also recognizing and doing so, placing it in the context of more mainstream, and I put the quotes up, mainstream psychology. And with that, hopefully being truer to the actual experiences of the breadth of experiences that is the African-American experience.
Mhm. Well, that's very exciting. It's like providing the data and the information that brings people to life more fully.
Absolutely.
That's very exciting. Now, you're one of the founders of the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context. How did the center come about, and what research can we expect to see coming out of it in the future?
Well, so the center came about, it's ironic, as many of the things that have occurred in my career literally goes back to 25 years before its founding, through friendships and conversations with founders, starting as an undergraduate at Howard University, and conversations with Robert Jagers, who was a graduate student at the time. And then through my years at Virginia, and having some outstanding students to work with and colleagues who became colleagues, including Stephanie Rowley and Tabby Chavis, and also the work with Carla O'Connor when we got here at Michigan, and having an opportunity to work with her, and Jackie Matisse when Jackie came back to Michigan. So these were really what I would consider the founders. And it was based on that initial premise of African Americans as being human, and wanting to be able to define and to study and to examine their lives from a place of normality. So to understand what normative development meant that you also had to understand what development meant for African Americans. And so that was an important part of us coming together, which led to our developing a proposal to NSF for a center grant, and led to a 3 district school study where we followed middle and high school students and their families, examined their psychological development, well-being development, their social development, their academic development, and of course their racial development, both identity as well as socializations. And then also examined experiences. So what were the kinds of experiences that they were having? And we looked at this across 3 different types of school districts. One was a school district that was where the community was predominantly African American. Another was a community that was about 50-50, where African Americans were about 50% of the population. And then a third community where there were only about 10% of the population, and wanted to see how context mattered. And we did both quantitative and qualitative work, looking at the school environment as well as the community environment. And look to see what was working and what wasn't working, both at the school level, at the community level, at the parenting level, as well as really looking at the many different strengths that the families, the kids, and the communities brought to impact the child's ultimate outcomes. So that was a major part of the center in terms of the way in which we all had been thinking and talking about this for literally 20 something years about what we would do if we grew up and we ever had an opportunity to come together. And it just so happened we all ended up at Michigan at a particular point in time and decided, hey, let's go for it. The second thing that was really important with regard to the center was we all have a deep commitment and burning energy around developing the next generation of students, students of color, and in particular, students of African descent. And so we saw the center as an opportunity to develop postdocs and graduate students and early career professionals, providing them with opportunities to utilize the data sets to gain some training in different approaches and taking the work and taking it to the next level.
Okay. I'm beginning to pick up on a theme here where you get involved in quite a bit of networking and collaboration with people over time. And that's impressive. And I like how you work. That's a very impressive way to include people and plant the seeds of the ideas and grow them, you know, when you have all these people. And I do note that you mentioned one of your collaborators as Tabby Chavis. Is that how you say her last?
Yes.
Who happens to be your spouse. And
yes.
I was noting what a power couple that is. Congratulations on that little aspect.
Well, I try not to embarrass her too much. So.
Okay. Well, I hope I have not just done that. Okay, so the action-oriented piece of the center's work is particularly interesting to me, and I think to others, and I believe a significant contribution. Can you speak more about the partnership between research and social action that you focused on? Because I think that a lot of us talk about that, how important that is, but very few of us actually carry it out.
Well, so I'm actually, one of the things I'm really excited about as it pertains to my career was when I became the Chief Diversity Officer, Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion at the university, there was an opportunity for us to develop a program that was based on a lot of the things that we learned from the center and the center's work and our work with the 3 districts outside of Detroit that I was mentioning. And Rob Jager's, this program was called Wherein Pathways. And so members of our CISBIC team, which is what we call our center, came together and developed this program, which is a college preparatory supplemental education experience. So we've brought kids in 3 school districts, not fully the same, but some overlap with those that were in CISBIC. Those districts of Detroit, Ypsi, and Southfield, which have a large African-American and students of color presence. And this college preparatory experience is for kids grades 7 through 12. It's a after-school weekend summer experience, or I should say a weekend and all day in the summer experience, where we provide not only supplemental education in English language arts, math, sciences, social sciences, but also from a culturally relevant perspective with a focus on community responsibility. And this program also has a component where we work with parents and develop larger parenting groups and how to support academically successful child as they're preparing for college. And as a function of this program, we also were able to have the program be a intervention at the university level, such that all the students who graduated from Wolverine Pathways, who apply and are admitted to the University of Michigan, whether it's the Ann Arbor campus, the Flint campus, or the Dearborn campus, are guaranteed a 4-year scholarship, tuition paid for, plus whatever other financial aid they may be eligible for.
Wow.
And so I'm really excited about that particular program because it not only worked with the students, but it also worked with the teachers at those schools and those school districts. So they got heavy supplemental professional development because they taught in our summer program, and then take what they've learned there and take it back to the kids, not only those who are in Wolverine Pathways, but those who are in their classes as well. So an opportunity to have an even greater impact. So we're now at our second class that is graduating from the University of Michigan. So overall, 85% of our Wolverine Pathway students have gone on to 4-year colleges or have graduated from 4-year colleges. And at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, we have so many Wolverine Pathway students that 1 out of 5 in-state African-American students is a Wolverine Pathway graduate. And we've developed programs on campus to continue to support those students all the way up. They serve as mentors to the earlier program. And this is work that was, again, envisioned early on by Rob Jagers, is now run by Carla O'Connor. Just been really excited to be able to actually take what we've learned from our early collaborations and create something that has had an impact on student lives, teachers' lives, and on the University of Michigan as well.
Those sound like pretty significant outcomes. It's really amazing. So many of your co-principal investigators in your many publications have been students of yours who've gone on to prestigious postings and prominent achievements in ethnic minority psychology. That says something about your philosophy on mentorship and preparing the next generation of researchers and academics. Could you describe that philosophy a bit more?
Well, first, I would say I've been blessed. I have been unbelievably blessed to have tremendous students throughout my time as a professor. And my first goal has been to try not to mess them up. I can honestly say I've learned far more from them than they've learned from me. At the same point in time, what I've tried to do is to have for them the same kinds of support and mentorship that I have been blessed to have throughout my life. To make it clear that what we do as part of a long chain, that there are folks that were here before we were, who in some cases we know, in other cases we will never know, who have made it easier for us, no matter how difficult it may be. And that we need to know that and understand that we're part of that chain. And that we have a responsibility to make sure that we also give that back to the next generation. And by understanding that, it also provides you with a benefit that you wouldn't know, that it becomes, the struggle is bigger than you. And as I've said, oftentimes, there are many times where it would be easy to quit if it was just about me. But the strength that others provide, knowing that you're part of a larger legacy and that you have a set of responsibility that is really purpose. So it really is Nia. It gives life meaning, which allows us to be resilient in times of difficulty. It gives us a framework, a framing, a light to move forward when things often may be dark. And so what I've tried to do is really just pour into my students the same kinds of things that were poured into me. I mean, I was blessed so many different times to have somebody go out of their way to help me in a way that if they hadn't, I would not be where I am today. And just to name a couple of people, because I really want to always give thanks, people like Kathy Berlew, Jules Harrell, Wade Boykin, James Jones, James Jackson, Melvin Wilson, Pat Gurin. All of these are people that and this is just a small number of the people, but these are people that I can clearly look at that had they not reached out and gone the extra mile at any given point in time in my career, I would not be where I'm at. So what I've tried to do is really not mess up really good folks, but to also try to instill that sense of legacy, that you're part of something that's much larger than you.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying there's sort of a generational sort of thing about mentoring. You've been the recipient as well as provision, and you're saying it's advantageous in all directions. I mean,
absolutely.
Absolutely. And you mentor as well as give. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And that is consistent with most of our culture's experiences, that we would not be here, would not have survived different things as a cultural group if there had not been this sense of connection across generations.
And it's amazing sometimes how little it takes for young people to feel support. Sometimes it's just a comment in passing that makes a big difference, as well as, you know, diving in and doing some intense work together, and everything in between. Yeah, wonderful. So in addition to your individual impact and mentorship, you also obtained funding from the National Science Foundation to sponsor an annual National Black Graduate Student Conference. Can you share how this conference has influenced upcoming academics?
Well, so this is a perfect example of what we were just talking about. So there used to be a conference that started in the late 1960s that brought together primarily African-American early career professionals. It was called the Black Empirical Conference. And it was with across generations to bring in 15 to 20 primarily early career faculty, along with 7 or 8 more senior faculty, and to come together in a space that was critical but supportive. So one of the things that African-American and students of color in general often have to worry about is whether or not they're getting honest feedback. Sometimes the most pernicious form of racism is being told that your work is good when it's not, or being not given critical feedback out of fear of it coming off as racist. And so creating an environment where individuals can get critical feedback and learn how to provide critical feedback, but to do so in a way that is supportive, that is about building up, that is about being better. So I had an opportunity to participate in the conference along with Melvin Wilson. And so we decided shortly after that, and this was when I was an assistant professor, that we wanted to do that for our students along with, so we were at the University of Virginia at the time, students in my lab, students in his lab, along with faculty at Howard, wanted to come together and bring our students together to have an opportunity to critique each other's work, to present, to get to know each other, to develop potential collaborators, et cetera. And that was sort of the beginning of the Black graduate conference in psychology. And that conference expanded over the years. So we would have anywhere between 60 and 70, 60 and actually 100 students, 10 to 15 faculty. The students are the ones that present. The students are the ones that ask questions and provide feedback. We have poster sessions as well as presentations. And over the years, we've had, we've had 23 of them. We've not had the last 3 years because of COVID, but I am committed to making sure that we started back up again. And so as a result, we had lots of students who came from places where there weren't anybody else of color there, who weren't doing work related to people of color and didn't feel like they were being supported, but they developed mentors and, more importantly, colleagues to help each other move through the case. So we've had more than 1,000 students go through the program, and a large portion of them are now faculty members or professionals in other routes doing great work. So it's just, again, another example of that chain, things that have happened in the past where people have poured into one generation and the next generation trying to pour it into the group after.
Mm-hmm. Now, it reminds me of when you were president of Division 45, the Society for the Psychological Study of Race, Ethnic Culture, and whatever it is now. You also began a conference for that division. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, yes. And that conference will be held in San Diego in July. And with, again, the idea of creating a space for top level, cutting edge scholarship at the same point in time across generations, with opportunities to mentor, opportunities to learn things that you otherwise wouldn't, designed for undergraduate students, graduate students, early career, mid-career, senior folks to come together and talk about the work in ways that too often we only are able to have those conversations on the side at larger conferences, in the corner, but in ways that aren't necessarily central. And so this is a place to allow us to be central.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. Shifting gears a little bit, you most recently served as the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at University of Michigan. And I believe you implemented a 5-year strategic plan. Can you please share with us more about your experience addressing those important issues during your 8 years in the position?
Yeah, so it was an opportunity to, again, as I mentioned, take some of the things that we've learned throughout our career and the work that we've tried to do in terms of promoting what we now call diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether in the field or in general. So the 5-year plan, something that I'm very proud of. It again was a collaboration of many people at the university. It had as its goal to first and foremost be subversive and empowering. So the way that we set up the plan was, instead of having a single plan that was at the level of the president or the level of the regents, we wanted the plan to be expansive and distributed throughout all aspects of the university. So there was a university level plan, as well as 50 other plans for every major administrative unit had to have its own plan that addressed the people, the process, and the product issues. So diversifying who we are in terms of students, faculty, staff, as well as other relevant groups. In terms of process, making sure that we have an equitable and inclusive process by which we live and work together. And then products, making sure that we infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion in our products. And as a institution of higher education, that means in our teaching and learning, that means in our scholarship, that means in our service, our mission to serve both the state of Michigan and the larger society.
Wow.
And each plan had to address all 3 of those across students, faculty, staff, and other folks, which led to 2,800 different action items. And 92% of those action items were accomplished. I'm proud to say that the university is more diverse across a number of different dimensions than it was at the beginning of the 5 years. We still have a long way to go, but we've made progress. So the goal was to move from diversity being a contested idea, where if you were in a faculty meeting and you wanted to talk about why we should look at this hire or our graduate admissions or our curricula in a particular way that infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion, you had a battle, and oftentimes an uphill battle. We wanted to move from a contested space to it being a core institutional value, that everything that we do at the university is consistent with that value. And then our long-range goal is to move from a value to it just being standard operating procedure. And I feel like we've made significant progress in that particular journey. Now you're at a space where diversity, equity, and inclusion, we, again, have a long way to go and still more work to do. And I'm very proud of the fact that there is a second 5-year DEI plan. And I hope that there's 55 plus 5-year DEI plans in succession, because as my mentor in this work told me when I first told him I was taking the job, he was the first person in a position like this at the university. He said, remember, Rob, that, and make sure that they understand that the university isn't going to change completely overnight. It took them 210 years to get like this. It ain't going to change completely in just 5 years. And so make sure that that commitment is a long-term commitment. So I'm also very proud of the institutionalization of these efforts. So it has survived now into 2 different presidencies, 2 different chief diversity officers, and 5 different provosts. So this is now officially a University of Michigan. It is part of who the university is, and we've entangled it into our budget process. We've entangled it into our admissions process, to our hiring processes, to our orientation processes, our curricula, et cetera. So I'm excited about where we are, but I'm even more excited about where we're going. I think our future is bright. It will be painful, but it will be bright.
Well, that's very, very, very impressive and very inspirational. And I was just wondering what a strategic plan would look like in Texas and Florida. I think that would have to be like 100-year strategic plan or something like that. And we'd have
That's all right. We're going to be around for 100 years. So might as well get started now.
We need to clone you and have you train many of us to do the kind of work that you've done there. Is really inspiring. So yes, so something that we've been discussing frequently at the American Psychological Foundation and central to this award is impact. How do you define impact in psychology, effectiveness in psychology?
I just think of impact as very simply making a difference in someone's life. That the extent to which you are actually making a difference in someone's life. And there are so many different ways in which you can make an impact in individuals' lives. Obviously, you can make an impact through therapy. You can make an impact by teaching. You can make an impact by changing the way in which particular groups are defined and how through one's scholarship. But you can also make an impact ideally by changing systems. Changing how systems work, changing our framework for understanding, and this goes back to my earlier discussion, what it actually means to be human. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And psychology is uniquely situated to define what it actually means to be human. Mm-hmm. So every other social science defines it in a context. So what does it mean to be political as a political scientist? Or what does it mean to be as a group as your sociology? And how do groups or from within an economy, what does it mean in those spaces? But psychology is the one place where you're fundamentally talking about what does it mean to be human, from the biological basis, the cognitive basis, the social basis, and it is that defining term and that defining power which has impacts on all the other social sciences, I would argue, which then means it has impacts on all the other professions and all the other things that make a change. And so the extent to which you can make a difference in an individual's life, and then hopefully also make a difference in changing a system, that's impact.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, you're right, psychologists can do that.
Yes.
We can do any number of these interventions.
Yes. And I would argue we have a responsibility to do so.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. Okay, so finally, before we turn to the questions that are in the question and answer, when you look at the future of the field, what do you see as important for the future of psychology, and what advice would you give to the next generation of scholars?
So, and I'm going to continue on that same thing. I think psychology to really reach its potential and not fall into prey to perhaps even becoming obsolete is it has to become a truly human field. It must move beyond being a field that is focused on the experiences of a small minority of the world's population, to actually embracing and encompassing the totality of the human experience. And the only way that occurs is if there are more people from more places being involved in ways that are inclusive, not just as subjects, but as inclusive in terms of defining our theories, defining our methods, defining our interventions, defining the way in which we train people. If we don't, we will become obsolete. We will define ourselves in a way that is so esoteric that has no impact, again, going back to that word, on anybody else's existence and life. And the way that it might be impactful, being negative, having been negative, impactful in some cases in the past, that folks are no longer allowing that to happen as people begin to define their own reality. So this means for students that that next generation has to demand a psychology that is broader than what we've historically been, has to demand a set of experiences that are broader than what we've historically been, has to be willing to share their own experience in shaping what true human behavior is, the totality of what human behavior actually is. And in doing so, though, one must also do it in a way that is disciplined, that is scholarly, that requires study. And that doesn't mean just one way, but it can't just be, well, because I feel this way, I'm going to say this is the way everything is. Because then you're just exchanging one limitation for another. So for that next generation, I strongly urge you to both learn what is part of sort of the mainstream canon, but understand that from a perspective of there's some aspects that may make sense because we're all human, and I can learn from everyone, but then there are other aspects that are limited that doesn't make sense. And be prepared to bring voices to the table around different experiences that have traditionally not been around the table, which requires extra, quite frankly, extra training, not just what you get in the class, but reading beyond that and reading outside of psychology and reading other fields, learning other methods, learning other approaches, learning other theories, and doing so in a critical way, and staying connected with the communities that you're studying, and staying connected with the folks who you're attempting to represent in your writings, or you're attempting to help through your therapy or your intervention, et cetera.
Yeah, I recall that you encourage multidisciplinary research through your center.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The one of the things that we did with the MMRI is we spent literally a year and a half reading sociology, political science, definitely history, literature and art, talked about the various folks that we knew before developing the MMRI. And still, I would say there's opportunity for more.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, with that, are we ready to open up the questions from the audience?
Yes.
Let's go to the question and answer. Let's see. The first question from an anonymous attendee is, especially as the country grows more diverse, What are your thoughts on the development of group-specific measures versus universal measures of ERI? Do you feel as if they compete or can complement each other?
That's a great question. So I actually think it's important. So historically, we've sort of done what I would call a Procrustean approach to understanding, particularly other groups. We start with an understanding from a group, and oftentimes it's the mainstream, but in racial identity research, it often started with African Americans, just at least in this country, given where some of those opportunities, early opportunities came, and then apply those to other groups. The challenge is, and the assumption is, well, is the experience of being African American the same as being Latino? Or is it the same as being Asian American? Well, there's certain experiences, aspects that probably are, that related to being marginalized in this and minoritized in this particular country at this particular time. At the same point in time, there are other aspects that are unique to each group. And so you can either start with what I would call that Procrustean approach, where I have a theory and I apply it to each group and see to what extent it fits or it doesn't fit. The problem is, if you do it that way, then all you can answer is, does it fit or does it not fit?
Right.
I have taken the approach that I want to understand a particular group well enough to try to hopefully capture their experience in ways that are consistent with their true experience. So for me, I've been more interested in the extent to which our work feels like it makes sense with the group, with African Americans, than I am with other forms of validity. Not that they're not important, but first and foremost, does this feel right? Does this make sense? And if you start off, so my fantasy is, if we all start off looking at our groups in ways that make sense and captures their experiences, then we can come together and see where there are commonalities and meta theories that make sense based on all that we know about each of our experiences as groups. Now, that's not a very parsimonious way to go about it. But I have always tended to be less interested in parsimony, because I'm more interested in complexity. And if you go to parsimony over complexity, you have a chance of missing some things that are really important. So I would personally start with trying to understand the folks that I'm studying moving forward. And then if we do a good job of understanding those folks, then coming together as a larger group and saying, yeah, well, that makes sense. That is something that's common to all of our groups. But this is something that's very different. So understanding, for example, language doesn't mean much in terms of African Americans. Now, in the larger diaspora, it does. But it doesn't have the same meaning as it might have, for example, in Latino group, Latinx group, or even different Asian American groups. And I would even argue within the Asian American speak. So I think there is an identity that is an Asian American identity, but there's also an identity that is a Vietnamese American identity, which is different from a Chinese American identity, which is different from a Japanese American identity. And in fact, an Asian American identity only makes sense outside of Asia. It doesn't make sense in Asia. It only makes sense outside of Asia, and probably only makes sense in spaces where there's not enough members of other groups that everybody gets lumped together. But being lumped together, the beauty of people is that we have this ability to meaning make. Mm-hmm. Just as if you think historically, for African Americans, it's that category is a social construction. And because that social construction actually ended up having meaning, that you were lumped in this group versus that group, over time, if it's meaningful, you also develop culture around it.
Yeah. And the context that you've mentioned so many times is so important, is what you said.
Context is absolutely important.
Yeah. And that's actually a good segue to the next question by Aaron Nash, I believe. How are you and your studies defining race? Is it solely physical characteristics? Is it certain cultural experiences? Is it values and beliefs? Is it ancestral descent? Some combination therein? Which category should have more significance when understanding race? A lot of our understanding of race, which invariably began from white European men, this seems subjective when it seems that every human can eventually trace their ancestry to Africa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I absolutely think of race as nothing more than a social construction. But of course, most things are nothing more than a social construction. But it's that meaning that's attached that makes a difference. So there's a reason why when we think about the MMRI, we're talking about people of African descent, primarily socialized in America. So it's not Black people. It's not people of the African diaspora. It was at best an effort to capture that construct of race. So even in our measure, we use the term Black, which may be dated at this point, but we use the term Black almost as a projective test, because we recognize for some people, Black meant anybody from the African diaspora. For other people, Black meant only people who were primarily socialized in America. But they saw an in-group with that Black. And other people, it was some combination. Yeah, so I think of Black people as, my in-group includes Jamaicans, but it doesn't include Asians or something, we could never define it in a way that would capture it across so many different folks. So what we're interested in is really, who do you define as your quote unquote racial in-group? And that definition is is for surely complicated, imprecise, inconsistent, but it is meaningful. And when it became that notion of race became salient to me, really salient to me, was about 20 years ago. I was watching golf because I got into it with Tiger Woods. Never watched golf before, and Vijay Singh, who is of Fijian descent and Indian descent, but if Vijay was walking down the street, at least most people would have thought he was a brother. But I knew Vijay was very different. That Vijay was not. I knew his background, his culture, etc. And I found myself rooting for Vijay, even though there were other folks who were white who had more in common culturally with me than Vijay. And it's simply because of race. And it's sort of that, because I know if Vijay was stopped by the police, he'd have a similar experience as I would.
Yeah.
And so that notion of race, I try not to get too caught up in defining it because it's been defined in so many different ways. But I do know, what is it? Was it pornography? I can't define it, but I know what it is when I see it. And that's the place in which we're thinking when we think about racial identity. And in doing so, we really do not want to reify race, and definitely don't want to deify race as a scientific construct. But it is a reality in the experience of, in this case, people of African descent in America. And historically it's been. But it looks very different now than when we first started.
But I love your example of Tiger and VJ, because basically you're talking about something that's a little bit intangible. It's who do we identify with? And it's not necessarily concrete variables. It's experiences that we may all have in common sometimes.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Raul, Rauf, I don't know if I'm saying that name correctly, wants to know that in terms of the potentially dynamic, fluctuating nature of racial identities that adolescents of color hold, what do you find are the most significant influences on their identity formation? For example, if their parents raise them with socialization messaging that would foster low public regard, but the adolescent demonstrates high public regard, how does one determine the weight of parental messaging versus other sources in the child's identity development?
So I think this is where my fallback answer is always context. So one of the things that one of our findings was that we found that this wasn't the racial socialization. This is an example of developmental processes playing out differently at different age points. So we found that parents' experiences of discrimination were associated with child outcomes, such that in general, parents who experience more discrimination, their child over time would have less positive outcomes around well-being, academic outcomes, self-esteem. Without looking, just looking at parents, the child, we didn't ask the child anything about the parents, but we just noticed that over time. But one of the things that we found is that as they got older, the strength of this relationship got weaker. So that in early adolescence, as parents and children were around each other, what parents experience was more impactful on the child. As the parents went further away, or as they got older, it became less impactful. And other work obviously suggests this is where peers come into play. At the same point in time, what I would say is I don't believe that parents' influences go away forever. And this is where episodic situations come into play. That one of the things that we have found is that in general, whether parents provide what we would call racial barrier messages, which are akin to low public regard. In other words, messages that discrimination exists out there. Oftentimes parents of color come to me and say, well, should I talk to my kid about race and racism? I don't want to scar them. How early should I talk to them about it? I don't want them to be afraid. I want them to see a world of possibilities, see a better world than I saw. And what we find is that giving those racial barrier messages are associated with more positive outcomes for kids who experience more discrimination. When they don't experience discrimination, when they don't report experiencing discrimination, then those racial barrier messages don't have much of an impact.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we also find is that having those racial barrier messages, it's important where their positive impact comes into play is when they also are given racial pride messages. So, and fewer negative race messages about it. So if you think about it, if you give your child nothing but racial barrier messages, that can make your child feel like the world is a pretty scary place. But if you also provide them with messages about the accomplishments that you as a group can actually have done, that you're part of a group for which you should be greatly proud of, those racial barrier messages can be much more protective in understanding how they may be mistreated and having a framework for understanding that isn't based specifically on them as an individual. So and such doesn't want to play with you, or you're not invited to the party because you're Black. That doesn't mean that being Black is a bad thing. It means that so and such is a racist, which has a very different impact on the child. On the other hand, what we found was not talking to your kids about race was fine, was associated with positive outcomes, as long as the child did not experience discrimination. And when the child experienced discrimination, but the parents had not talked to them about race, those children did worse than all the other children. So there's this almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. And we keep finding this finding over and over with low public regard. Low public regard in the context of experiencing discrimination, and low public regard means that you believe other groups have less positive attitudes towards African Americans. In other words, you believe African Americans or your group is discriminated against, that discrimination exists. That low public regard, when you experience discrimination, is protective. But when you're not experiencing discrimination, or when you're in situations where it is much more ambiguous, then it is likely to be associated with higher levels of stress. And that's because you're more likely to experience certain situations as being racially discriminated. And we know experiencing racial discrimination is stressful. Even when you're mistreated, you have this exact same mistreatment, but it's not based on race. We find it to be more noxious. So the damned if you do, damned if you don't, again, comes back into play. And it really comes down to, do you believe that this is a world where your child is not going to experience discrimination? And if that's the case, then you can get away with not talking to your child about racism. And if not, it's almost like a vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Whew. This stuff is painful.
Yes.
Okay, so Judith Arroyo says, how do you see the likely Supreme Court ending affirmative action will affect your DEI efforts?
Well, the DEI efforts at Michigan, none at all, because we're actually, we, like California, have a state constitution that prohibits the use of race, gender, and national origin in admissions, hiring at universities. So we've in effect been under this since 2005. But it's going to have a big impact. And I think it depends on, from what we've learned at Michigan, is if you believe that the ending of affirmative action means that you can no longer work to diversify your institution, and you stop trying, then it's going to have a huge negative impact, not only for groups of color and lower income whites as well. More importantly, and I do mean this, more importantly, our science, our humanities, our social sciences are going to suffer tremendously. And as a larger society, we are all going to suffer, because you cannot be excellent in the academic game without being diverse.
Yeah. And
without having diverse perspectives.
Yeah.
Progress does not occur with everybody being the same. It, by definition, innovation is someone asking a question or seeing something different than everyone else did. And asking that question usually comes from a different set of schema. And that schema usually comes from a different set of experiences. And those different sets of experiences are definitely tied to our different social identities. And so if we as a society do not, again, going back to my larger point, are not opening up to the contributions that have traditionally been left out, then we're in trouble. I used to say my biggest fear was the answer to global warming is sitting with a kid in Detroit who, if he came to the University of Michigan's school for ecology and I forget, our C school, our natural resource school, would have come up with the solution for global warming just simply because of their experience. They'd ask a question slightly different than nobody else had asked. The cure for cancer is because it is sitting with a kid in Bakersfield who doesn't have an opportunity to go to UC Berkeley, who together would have looked at the human genome just slightly different, just because of something in their experience growing up and their culture results in them asking the question slightly different. So it's going to be problematic for communities that have traditionally not had access, but the real irony, and perhaps it's justice in some way, is that we all are going to pay. And so it's really important for those of you who are at institutions right now that after this ruling comes, that you do not let your institution believe that they no longer can do anything with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things that they can do. And one of the first things is to realize that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a key strategy for excellence, for academic excellence, that you can't be excellent without being diverse. And being diverse doesn't get you excellent without also being equitable and inclusive. And I would even include just.
So I think an important takeaway is that universities, institutions, organizations can continue to promote the value of diversity. They just won't have the legal protections.
Right. Well, you just have to, so this is getting rid of a particular tactic.
Mhm.
And too often, though, we think, okay, you got rid of that tactic, so therefore we can't continue our strategy. So there are a number of other tactics that one can put into play. So for instance, in one of the reasons why we become less diverse, think about the underlying tactics. So institutions have lots of feeder schools. And those feeder schools look a certain way demographically. Often, rarely do they look like the underrepresented folks. But so there's no reason why we can't have feeder schools that do look like the underrepresented folks. And then you're not making a decision based on any individual's race. But if that particular district or school happens to have a particular demographic makeup, that's fine.
So you're
So, oh, I'm sorry. No.
you're essentially encouraging us to carry the torch that DEI is to strive for excellence.
It is absolutely to strive for excellence. That it is not. So when DEI is the reason why you're doing it is it's the morally right thing to do, or even the socially just thing to do. That's the first thing that goes when resources get tight.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes an extra burden. But when it is inherently a part of the mission of the institution or the mission of the organization, and it is seen as a strategy to achieve the mission, then when you start getting into questions about resources and effort, then the response is, well, this is fundamental to what we're supposed to be doing. It's not additive. It's not morally right. I mean, it is all of those things, and I'm down for all those things. But the bottom line is, if your institution's goal is to achieve academic excellence, it can't do it without being diverse, equitable, and inclusive. If you're at a land grant institution and you have a strong land grant mission, well, fundamentally, you are serving the entire community. It doesn't say serve one group or one part of society. You have a responsibility to serve the entire state or the entire country, depending on the nature of your mission. And so that means everything from making sure that you're admitting a diverse set of students to making sure that your curriculum is inclusive of all of the different contributions, CRT. So for those of you in Florida, because it doesn't just hurt the groups that are left out, it hurts everyone in terms of the quality of the education that you're being provided. Where is your institution's money? What banks are they holding it? What does their suppliers look like? Because most of us who are at large public institutions, we're one of the biggest economic engines in our state, just as an organization. So is your institution holding its money in banks that are either minority owned or, more importantly, providing resources to the minority communities? Where are hospitals servicing? So we cutting edge medicine, but who's getting access to that cutting edge medicine? And all of these are things that have nothing to do with affirmative action.
You may need to set up a think tank, or we all need to, about how to implement diversity, DEI, in the face of the failure of the Supreme Court to support affirmative action.
Well, we're getting calls, and we're taking calls, and we're talking with as many people that are interested, and we'll continue to do so.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, and we have a little short of about 9 minutes left. So now
I'll try to be quick.
I assume that Gordy Hall is a friend of yours because he wants to know, is there a particular type of chili that has sustained your amazing career?
I have no idea who Gordy Hall is. And no, I'm just teasing. We have a long-standing argument. Well, it's not even an argument. He just can't understand that Cincinnati chili is the very best chili in the world.
Cincinnati chili.
Yes. Have you had Cincinnati chili? Cincinnati chili is the very best.
What are you talking about?
I know. So soon you're probably going to hear from Michael Zarate too, who will probably have a similar argument that Texas chili is fine. So again, diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're all wonderful things.
I guess y'all have a running argument about that.
Oh, it's only been 20 years.
Yes, okay, all right. So Aaron Nash comes back and says, thank you for the answer, sir. It seems that race tries all at once to capture ethnicity, nationality, physical characteristics. As a general rule, would it be appropriate to view race and a proxy for some cultural values and experiences? I do think that the traditional categories when it comes to the physical features can be relevant in some instances. However, in our understanding of psychology, there is no direct causal relation between physical characteristics and behavior, i.e. the fact that I produce more melanin than white counterparts has nothing to do with intelligence level. Do you see a time where racial categories becomes less relevant, especially as our country becomes diverse and interracial couples become more prevalent?
I think race is going to be very different. It is very different now than 20 years ago when we first wrote, 25 years ago now, when we first wrote the MMRI. And it was different than it was 25 years before that, and it's going to be very different down the line in another 25 years. It'll be interesting to see how it morphs in, and it's less important per se race as it is what are the ways in which we categorize ourselves and don't categorize ourselves, and what are the things that result in us bonding as a community, because it has nothing to do, I don't think it, again, has anything to do with physical notions of race, because as a construct, as a category, it's bankrupt. But again, I don't know any other, I would also say that for just about any other categorization. So ethnicity, yeah, ethnicity, but it plays in different ways. And it's really important to understand the history and the context of it. So as we used to say, being Black in Provo, Utah means something very different than being Black in Harlem. So in Provo, Utah, anybody that might look remotely Black becomes your in group, right, most likely. And if you're in a place like New York, you got African Americans, you got Haitians, Jamaicans, Dominicans, Nigerians, and strong connections within and between, and it looks very different. Same as if you're Asian American, probably in Cincinnati growing up when I was there, that was a catch-all.
Right.
If you're again Hmong in Los Angeles or San Francisco, completely different thing. So it's all, I hate to keep falling back. It's complicated and it's contextual.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And so, yeah.
I'm going to have to move on. Shelley Bursey just has a comment that she loves that Dr. Sellers is talking structurally about DEI efforts and the need for critical approaches like CRT in our field. Thank you for that. Now, before we stop, Dr. Sellers, Rob, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to share?
Well, I guess the one thing that I would say is I am really optimistic. I know these last few years have been unbelievably painful for many of us, particularly in this country and this society. And as I look every morning when I wake up and I turn on CNN and the next group of folks are killed from a mass shooting, or the next politician says something racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever, and we as a community, as a society, with COVID, et cetera, just tear it apart, I do strongly feel optimistic about the future. And that's because when I get an opportunity to see the young scholars, the students, early career professionals, the kinds of questions, the work, the frameworks that they're bringing out there, it just, I'm very hopeful for what our future will ultimately look like. I think we have far more going for us than we do against us. And that even though there are constantly things winds blowing in our face, that we have what it will take to again continue to move us forward. So I think that's the last thing that I would say. I hope while being realistic about the challenges that we face, that I'm also make it clear that I'm optimistic about our ability to face them in the future.
And that's a wonderful note to end on. But before we do end, I do need to make one more comment from the audience, from James Jones, who you mentioned earlier as a mentor. He's certainly a mentor to me as well. He says, Rob, I accept your claim to the reality of Cincinnati chili. In fact, I'm making it this weekend to accompany the victory of the Cincinnati Bengals over the San Francisco 49ers.
That's right. Hooday!
So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I think that of many of our participants, for taking the time to speak with all of us, Dr. Sellers. It is an honor to learn more about you and from you, and also to celebrate your amazing commitment and impact in the field of psychology. And congratulations again on your well-deserved gold medal award. And I want to thank all the attendees for joining us today. Our final fireside chat with our 2022 recipients will take place next month with Dr. Adam Leventhal. And by the way, these are recorded and available for later viewing. Somebody asked that a while ago. We also invite you to share the recording and information for future fireside chats with anyone you think may be interested in joining. We at APF wish you and your loved ones safety and health in 2023. Thank you again, Dr. Sellers, and to all of you. Have a great evening, everyone.